And welcome everyone to this call of the UK chapter of the Internet Society. We have been doing some webinars on many occasions in the past, but the first few months of this year have seen us slow down a little bit, and I'm hoping that we can start again and to have regular webinars on various topics. So if a topic comes up that you would like to share with everyone, then let me know, get in touch with me. I'm Olivier Crepin-Leblond. I'm the chair of the UK chapter of the Internet Society, and I will be, I guess, chairing today's call. But the main person that everyone's come to speak to and to listen to actually is Ansgar Koene, who has been is at the University of Newcastle. I'm completely lost. Nottingham, there we go. I don't know why I had Newcastle in my head. University of Nottingham. Ansgar has presented to us a number of times, first on the Unbiased project, and then afterwards following up on the Reintrust project. And no doubt he's going to tell us a lot about these two projects. This is something that's gone on for a number of years, so we're not dealing here with just very early days. In fact, I think that we'll probably have a lot of answers also being provided today. Obviously, such research has no bounds, and I'm sure there's a lot more to do, especially since this field is just so vast. But without me, rambling on about things, so I'd like to welcome Ansgar. I know that some of his colleagues from the project are also on the call. So they're absolutely very welcome to take the floor as well and to add to things. We've got a 1 hour in front of us, basically. So hopefully we'll go through all the background and so on, and then let's make this an interactive session with questions, comments, etc. You can use the chat, and of course you can put your hand up. In the meantime, while Ansgar is speaking, could I ask you all to mute your microphones? Sometimes one forgets to do that. I'm guilty of this on many occasions, and it's disruptive for the speaker. So mute your mics, and then yeah, over to you, Ansgar. Thank you for coming to us, and let's hear about what's happening on this this Reintrust project, and you know the overall results that you've had so far.
Sure, great. Thank you very much. And it's great to be back presenting to the ISOC UK. I haven't been joining in much in the last couple of months, unfortunately. Various things have taken over a lot of my time, which actually brings me to one point, which is that my own involvement with the Reintrust project actually reduced quite dramatically about 1.5 years ago due to my taking up a position with EY. And so when it comes to details of how the project has run, I will gladly hand over to Philip or others from the project who are on the call today. So let me just share a couple of slides to get us all synced on what we're talking about, and then as I said, I hope we will have a open conversation. So the Reintrust project, Reintrust stands for Rebuilding and Enhancing Trust in Algorithms, and we are really interpreting algorithms fairly liberally, as in also thinking about the space within which these algorithms are being used, so the online platforms and those kinds of things, because users, the general person who's engaging with these systems doesn't really make a strong hard delineation between saying, well, this is an issue that is to do with the actual recommender algorithm versus this is something to do with the user interface, or this is an issue of the way in which this organization behaves. All of these things are closely interwoven, and so it doesn't really make sense to try and say something about how people experience this kind of space and then enforcing kind of delineations that people don't actually make. Let me just get So the project started in 2018, actually. It's an EPSRC funded project which brought together the University of Oxford, Edinburgh and Nottingham. The same teams basically that were on the Unbiased project, but in this case, the University of Oxford took over leadership. The project leader was Marina Girotka. I will occasionally probably alternate between the is and was, because the project is actually completed now, but some bits of it are still continuing, as tends to happen with these things. For anybody who is interested in the details, and also, for instance, checking who all of the different people were who are involved in the project, the project website is reintrust.org. So the main objective of the project is around trust, technologies for rebuilding trust, design with partners and general public, so very much looking at things like responsible research and innovation and co-design kind of questions, contributing to policy and regulation, and advancing the state of the art about AI and trust. And so, bringing together both more of a computer science kind of dimension around how can we actually build certain mechanisms into these platforms that will help people get better trust relationships, but also combining that with social science perspectives around really the people's side, the understanding people's psychology and how they engage with these platforms. Trust obviously is a big issue, and algorithmic systems are so pervasive nowadays, automated decision making, online platforms and those kinds of things, but they are also pervasive in the news, and frequently when they hit the news headlines, it is in a negative way, and that impacts people's general kind of sense of unease when engaging with these kinds of systems. So that results in a breakdown of trust. Users don't know, can I trust this kind of algorithm? Also, they keep hearing about how platforms are abusing data that is being collected, using it for other purposes than what is originally being communicated. And then there's the whole cybersecurity dimension to it. So there's a lot of issues that cause people to lose trust in these kinds of in this environment. So the intention of Reintrust was to explore how to rebuild this. The work packages, 4 core work packages looking at responsible policy and practice, so understanding what are the current policy developments, things like the ICO's guidance on explaining automated decision making, things like the exploration that the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation is currently doing around AI auditing, for instance, and how can we contribute to these kinds of directions based on the data coming out of the engagements with users. And so that's work package 2, for instance, is user-centered trust studies. So focusing on how people are engaging with that using the same kind of open deliberative process that was also used in the Unbiased project. And then work packages 3 and 4, we're focusing more on the computational methods. So building some sandbox experiments around certain types of interfaces and certain types of transparency that we might be able to give around how these systems operate, and then run those with users to see what kind of an impact that actually has on their sense of trust. And so the main user groups for this project were 2 distinct ones. One is older adults aged 65 and over, and the other younger adults 16 to 25. And really the idea was to identify what kind of differences or similarities there might be between factors that affect people's trust. And so looking at, of course, trust is a complicated concept in actually. We keep talking about trust and trustworthiness, but what do we actually mean with this? So part of the background literature research and thinking was to look into these kinds of factors, and Philip is actually much more of an expert in this than I am. Things like clarifying that trust has two core components to it. One is the competence or ability of the party that you're trusting in to actually be able to deliver on what they said. So this goes towards things like the accuracy of the algorithm, or just the ability to if I place an order, will I actually receive this, because their ability to ship things works. The other element is much more sort of on the psychological level, is whether or not there are honest intentions behind this. Do I believe that the party I'm engaging with is not going to cheat me? So this is where things like fairness, but also transparency, not so much just about the technical aspects of the algorithm, but more about the way in which the whole organization is operating and using the algorithms comes into play. Trust is about questions around altruism and social norms. And it's very important from a business kind of perspective, from a societal perspective, because a high trust environment reduces the cost of interaction. If I'm in an environment where I can't trust, that means every step I need to build in extra safeguards. I need to double check whether this transaction has actually happened, etc. It just drags everything down. And so this pervasive kind of sense of distrust that is coming around the online platforms and through that various internet-driven technologies risks increasing the cost of using these. The other element is that trust requires that there is an ability of that there is free choice involved. This is sort of the if we have a monopoly, a monopolistic service provider, and that is the only place where you can go to get this, there isn't really a discussion about trust, because you either use this place or you can't get the service. So there's a connection to competition environment, multiple service providers existing, those kinds of elements. We didn't really go into that into a huge extent in this project. And so getting to the policy recommendations. So really what we did here was to look at the kinds of outcomes that we saw in our engagements with the users, in our sandbox experiments and those kinds of things, and try to connect those to the kinds of policy directions that we are seeing. For instance, the question about transparency, we've seen quite a number of initiatives, things like the ICO-ATI's guidance on transparency for automated decision making, but also various positions about, are you allowed to use artificial neural networks that are difficult, that are black box systems in certain contexts, yes or no? This keeps coming up, but when we look at the way in which our users are actually interacting with these questions, what comes out is that there's a need for much more of a systemic approach to the question about transparency. It's not just about how does the algorithm work. It's also about what is the underlying business model? What is happening? What kind of data is being used and where is it going after that? What is the actual purpose of the system within the organization? People want that. And so our policy recommendation here is around suggesting that the government should support creation of detailed guidance on systemic transparency that takes the bigger picture of what is this environment that our people are engaging in. The other element is, we've seen a number of these guidances being published, but if you actually talk to various companies, you get often the kind of question, of, okay, but it's a guidance, it's not a regulatory requirement, so does that mean I actually have to do this? If I don't really have to do this, I'd prefer not to, because I have so many other things that I need to worry about. So we argue that it would be beneficial to have a review of the level of uptake that is actually happening regarding the current guidances that exist. To what extent are companies or other organizations actually using the ICOs as guidance? And is there this difference between larger companies versus smaller companies, etc., in that kind of thing, in order to identify where is extra support needed? Because support for stakeholders is also is our third point here, especially SMEs are under a lot of pressure to reach that next deadline, to get that next bit of funding in order to just even be able to continue to exist. They need support to be able to do things like engaging with stakeholders, identifying the needs of certain communities, doing the whole explanation and checking whether explanations are understandable by the users, etc. So the second set of recommendations that we came to is around engaging with users and considering the application context. So trust is contextual, we all know that. It depends on many factors, that related to completing of the task. And one thing that we saw from looking at these two different age groups, for instance, that the older population expressed that they would have a tendency to want to trust more established institutions that they had familiarity with, also from the offline space, partly because that gave them a sense of, I understand sort of the bigger picture of what they stand for. I have trust in that their intentions are good, those kinds of things. However, both older and young have, of course, also a big element of the trust is whether or not the website is actually delivering on it. If I order something from an online retailer, if I don't receive it within the space where they said, then I'm going to start losing trust in it. They simply, even if they had the best intentions and they return my money, I won't feel like I can actually use that kind of site. It's not it's just not capable of delivering on that first part of the trust dimension, the ability to perform. So within this context, the policy recommendations we were looking at are around encouraging co-creation approaches with the diverse user base. So if you have identified that your target customers for something are a certain kind of demographic, then you should be engaging with them during the creation process in order to, at the earliest possible stage, identify what are possible points where trust might break down. And since engaging with users in this kind of way is not an easy thing to do, we see an important potential role there for innovation hubs. So governments or council-sponsored places where things like citizen panels can be created that you could access in order to get this kind of feedback. As well as providing just the training and tools around how to do co-creation. It's not that super simple. Another recommendation is around cross-disciplinary expert panels. So having a panel that understands the different disciplinary elements to this, the technology element, the social science element, also the political element, to do an assessment of algorithmic system distrust among different population groups in order to really identify, are there particular other kinds of recommendations that should be made for certain population groups, be that age group, be that cultural background group, etc. And finally, promoting the uptake of responsible innovation frameworks. There's been a number of frameworks being developed. The Orbit RI, for instance, has developed the area anticipate, reflect, engage, and act framework around how to do responsible research and innovation. The BSI published a document around responsible innovation as well. There are standards in this space. To what extent are they actually being used? And how can, what kind of additional incentives can be provided in order to promote the uptake of these? The final set of recommendations is geared around increasing citizen awareness of algorithms. So as I mentioned, one of the starting points here is just people are, the use of algorithmic automated processes in the engagement with citizens is becoming so pervasive. It is no longer a choice of engaging with these. However, they remain a space that is not understood by most people. And this lack of understanding is an obvious area where people can generate distrust or a lack of knowing whether they can trust. And so getting better levels of awareness around the sort of the core principles is an important element. And so we are suggesting promoting awareness through things like including algorithmic literacy in national events like a Safer Internet Day. Don't just talk about be safe online, but also talk about, and this is how the online environment actually operates. Develop and endorse algorithmic literacy programs, and these need to be tailored to the different groups. In the most sort of crass kind of thing that we've been hearing is that even within schools, the internet literacy, digital literacy programs don't change significantly from one year to the next. So you are just getting the same program more or less every time. And it doesn't reflect the differences in which children are engaging with these. This was more something from Unbiased Project. The same is true for adults. Different groups have different needs for understanding how these systems operate. And then finally, commissioning some means around communicating trustworthy innovation. So this goes back to the age-old almost kind of problem that we've had. How do we communicate in the online environment that this is a safe website to go to? So in a similar kind of sense, how do we communicate that this is a trustworthy organization? Things like membership of business associations could be an element, but perhaps there can be other elements to this as well. And we recommend engaging with BSI, but also things like OECD and WEF in this space. OECD, for instance, currently has some work around how to classify different AI systems according to certain features, which could then be useful for policymakers. There's actually a consultation about that at this moment, and those could potentially be useful as well. So that is our rapid sort of overview of what the project was looking at and the kinds of policy recommendations that we presented last week at the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Data Analytics. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. But maybe, and as a very first, maybe I'd like to ask Philip if there was something important that I missed out, and without that, you're completely misunderstanding the project.
If I just intervene quickly, yes. No, I thought it was a very good summary. I mean, we did a very interesting work with what I was mostly involved with, I guess, was the sometimes called algorithmic playground or sort of sandbox, which enabled us to tweak various parts of people's interaction with mock-ups of algorithms. And we were particularly interested in, well, the initial kind of question we had was, to what extent does explanation, as Ansgar touched on. I think what is a kind of useful kind of explanation that people want? To what extent is it kind? Does explanation help people to trust algorithms? And I think I mean this is a question actually which has been touched on in various other parts of the literature. It seems fairly obvious that if you could only explain to people how a particular result was arrived at, then surely they'll be happy with that. And it turns out that well, maybe our explanations were, it's hard to get the right kind of level. Our explanation was extremely high level, so we didn't attempt to say it fell at this particular point on a support vector machine or a particular weighting in a neural net or something like that. No, that would be completely difficult for anybody to understand. But I think, as Ansgar has suggested, I mean, I think the main point is an explanation. Really, people are much more interested in the kind of systemic way in which the algorithms fit into the organization and the interaction you're having. This is actually far more of concern to people than exactly why did it recommend this particular hotel to you, or exactly why are certain people being offered jobs in an e-recruitment site or something like that. Yeah, I mean, another finding that we had, which came out of some of the earlier work we did in the project, was that it matters quite a lot to people what the context of the interaction is. So we did some experiments with a mock-up of a hotel booking system, and we got some quite interesting results. But at the end of the day, unless it's perhaps for something really important like a big holiday or something, people don't actually mind all that much which hotel it's recommended, as long as it's, broadly speaking, fits the criteria that they've asked for. Whereas for things like well, financial services decisions, for example, medical decisions, or the example that we used in our experiment, e-recruitment systems, there's, this matters a lot more to people. And actually, so e-recruitment, of course, is the whole minefield, really. The sort of where the bias, which is often exhibited by AI systems, actually starts to really matter and to really have a big influence on people's life chances. So I think those are the only extra points I wanted to kind of add. So hopefully have a good discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for this, and Philip, and thank you for your presentation, Ansgar. I am going to open the floor now for questions and comments. We've got a good 30 minutes or so to be able to go through these. As I mentioned in the chat, so you could either type your question or comment in the chat, and I, of course, encourage our panelists and everyone to respond to these as well. But also, if you wish to speak, then you can put your hand up and you'll be placed in the queue. In order to put your hand up, for those people that are not aware of the changes in Zoom, you have to click on reactions, and on reactions, you've got raise hand. That's it's bizarre. It used to be a button right there and then, but now it's reactions first and then raise hand. I have a couple of questions. First, I'll read a couple of questions on the chat, but the question I had was something that Ansgar mentioned, and that's standards. You mentioned standards being developed. Are these mandatory standards, or are these just like guidelines? And do you see ultimately that we're going to see regulation of artificial intelligence as something that is being needed, or are we likely to have a more open world where there'll be voluntary standards and there we are?
Sure, that's an important question, obviously. Standards, the standards developing organizations, the SDOs, obviously, they don't have the power to mandate these kinds of things. They are developing the standards. These are effectively best practice. However, the proposed EU AI regulation that was published in April does make reference to harmonized standards as something that they will be looking to. And the European Commission has already mentioned to the new CENELEC standards working, the Joint Technical Committee on AI, the JTC 21, that they will be requesting the development of specific standards to help with the implementation of the AI regulation. So that is a area where a government-led mandating is pointing towards the use of standards. Obviously, it is always possible to show compliance with the regulation without using the standards, but that will generally be more complicated, more difficult. The other usual way in which standards become semi-mandated is through things like contractual requirements. If certain standards become the de facto, if you can't show that you've used this, then the next step in your supply chain isn't going to be willing to make a contract with you, then that way they become something that is much more used. However, we don't really see that happening just yet, primarily because most of these standards aren't even published yet; they're still in development.
But when you ask a corporation about its algorithms, often they cite company confidentiality for not giving it, don't they? I mean, it's for them it's prime intellectual property. A search engine is not going to provide you with details on how it classifies results and how it does this. How can you get around this? I mean, it seems to be pretty hard.
So this was, in a sense, also covered by the ICO's guidance on explaining algorithmic decision-making, which is to say, for most users, they're not interested in the technical details of how the algorithm works, which is effectively where the actual intellectual property resides. They're interested in the big picture concept behind it. They're interested in knowing that the way the search results are listed is based purely on the popularity as opposed to the actual quality of the content and those kinds of questions, so that they are better able to interpret the types of results that they're receiving. And I mean, this was, I think the ICO and the Alan Turing Institute in their guidance did a really good job in sort of pointing out these different types of explanation, and that ideally you want to be creating certain types of explanation for certain audiences. You will have a certain, a more detailed technical explanation for a regulatory audience, and that is not going to be made public. And you're going to have a different type of explanation that is addressing more these broad strokes types of concerns and questions that are given over to the general public.
Michael Malkin has a question which actually goes in this direction. Michael, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks very much. I've actually I had a question which I posted, but this is really more about the standards world. I'm an international standards person around smart cities, so that's where I spend most of my time. But I've just started to do some work with Open and Agile Smart Cities, which works quite closely with the European Commission. They're looking at trustworthy AI, and it's really about algorithms, algorithmic systems, and how we can make sure that particularly cities or public administrations can make sure that when they procure algorithmic systems to help them in their work, that they're procuring ones that they can trust and that their citizens can trust. And so they're looking at various principles. And there are two things. One is that a number of cities, including Amsterdam, are working closely with the Commission to develop procurement guidance. This is like linking to what you're saying, minimum guidance about procuring trustworthy AI systems in Europe. So some work has already been done and is going to be continued. And there is an expectation indeed that there's going to be clear procurement guidance that certainly the public sector is likely to take up in a major way across Europe. So that's going to help in that way. And the thing that we're doing in Open and Agile Smart Cities is to look at then how can you look at the other side of it and say, what are the requirements that there needs to be there for on algorithmic systems, and how can you test them? How can you check as far as possible automatically and so on. So these things are happening. I'm very new, actually. I've got a wonderful, wide, high-level overview of these things, but not in real depth. And I'd be very I'd be very grateful if there's people who can help talk through and guide. I think other people have said this too, to guide about the kind of literature and resources to help to understand, what are practical things that could be done to help to help. And then just quickly leading on to the other point, that a lot of what you've been talking about is how to help citizens be able to, or citizens be more willing to trust algorithms. And that's really important, because a lot of it is either they're not aware and they're not making informed decisions, or alternatively, they're making wrong, they're trusting or they're not trusting or whatever. So education, informing is important, but of course, you could educate people, or you could provide information that's actually slightly misleading, and you could encourage people, citizens, to trust algorithms when they shouldn't. So I mean, this is the thing, certainly, ethics and public sector governments and so on, looking at is not just how to help persuade citizens to be more willing, because they're more informed, to trust algorithms when they're good and helpful, but also how can you be really sure that the algorithms that you're using can genuinely are genuinely fair, are trustworthy, are accurate, and providing reliable and effective results. So, and that's kind of the side, I guess, where standards are really looking at. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what you've been pointing at also within the Smart Cities project, there is a lot of these, actually also a lot of the standards and a lot of the other kinds of work around technically trying to make the algorithmic systems more trustworthy, is really focusing on this question about making sure that the system delivers on what what it's supposed to be doing. But the problem is that it's about what it's supposed to be doing is defined by the organization that built or is using the system, and isn't necessarily the same thing as what the citizen thinks it is intended to be doing. Yeah, that question about, can I actually trust the intentions of the other side that I'm engaging with, isn't really addressed by most of these approaches, which is what we're trying to get at when we're talking about the co-development and the citizen panels and those kinds of approaches that are about engaging directly with the community during the development process. And what that requires, in a sense, is for the organization that's developing the systems to be willing to open up to a certain kind of external scrutiny in the process. Obviously, that does raise then, again, the sort of issues around intellectual property, or somebody potentially, my competition can try to be in the citizen panel and figure out what I'm trying to build and then build before I was able to bring it to the market, those kinds of questions. So that's why there should be a role for making these panels more institutionally generated. So they're not ad hoc created. There is a selection process and those kinds of things around it. What we're thinking about really is kind of a parallel approach to the way in which the medical community uses patient panels to do provide feedback and review around how medical community is operating. And so this is, I think, an area that hasn't attracted quite that much attention when it comes to the how to make these services more trustworthy, the question about how to actually engage with the stakeholders during the development process. But the RRI community is, this is a, this kind of co-creation is a core element of responsible research and innovation. So there is existing work on how to do this. And if Philip wants to elaborate more on this, then please do.
Thanks for this, Ansgar. Next, there's a question from Dan Meigen. How were your recommendations received by the Interparliamentary Group, since these were presented last week?
So the conversation seemed quite positive and good. I have to admit that I did not necessarily see a strong kind of, wow, this recommendation is something that we hadn't thought about. We definitely need to be implementing this. It was more of a, this sounds reasonable. We will take it into consideration. Let's see whether or not the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, for instance, will come up with something on this. Unfortunately, I feel like it's a bit difficult to say, are they really intending to take this on board or not? At least I wasn't able to read that cleanly. If somebody else who was on the panel, who was on the present during the session, has some views on this, please, I'd be interested.
I see Philip.
Yeah, I think I think I very much concur with that. I mean, we've written this nice policy briefing, which obviously we hope will have some influence on policy. I don't think we're necessarily expecting that it will directly lead on to some kind of bill or anything like that. But yeah, I think I agree with Ansgar that I didn't really see anybody particularly saying let's pick this up and see if we can get a private members bill or influence the next Queen's speech or something like that. I mean, I think, you know, it's difficult to know how these things usually like a long burn, aren't they? So hopefully, if EPPGDA is one forum, and I'm sure they will be taking our recommendations into consideration when they in their future work. But hopefully also other people, because this is now a public document, other people will pick this up as well, hopefully. So yeah.
I mean, did you get a feeling that their work was already as advanced as the work that you had done, or you basically brought a large chunk of new things forward?
So I do have the impression that most of the work that has been done in this kind of space has been following the same pattern as what we're seeing internationally, very much the focus on how can we make these systems technically robust and technically reliable in their performance, and then potentially a question about how can we demand accountability around things like what kind of data has been used, and building on the data protection frameworks and those kinds of things. What I think we brought to the table that is somewhat different is this approach of actually saying we need to be engaging with the end users as part of the development cycle in order, if you really want to be increasing people's ability to gauge the trustworthiness of these systems. So, you know, picking those things up from the responsible research and innovation community, which I think have not really been translated into this ethical AI or whatever you want to, how you want to phrase it, kind of space of discussion. There's, both of these are, you know, overlapping spaces, but they haven't really communicated enough yet, I think, to take on board the kind of thinking and learning that the RRI community has actually been in building for a while. And I think one of the other elements there is also our pointing out that you know, the transparency of those kinds of questions need to be taking a more systemic approach, that you can't say it's just about the algorithm, it's just about this part of the platform. You need to be talking more broadly about how the whole organization is operating, because that is where a lot of the trust questions lie.
Thanks, Ansgar. There's a question and in fact an exchange in the chat with Ruth Moulton mentioning the current debate around the national health system, the NHS, gathering data and then pseudonymizing it in some way. It's not anonymizing it, it's pseudonymizing it apparently, and many people don't trust this process, partly because the data could be sold to other organizations or passed on to organizations. I mean, have you looked into this type of topic and on pseudonymizing of data and things?
it wasn't really sort of in the center of the work that we were looking at. Maybe Philip might want to augment what I'm saying now, but in the previous project, the Unbiased project, when we were talking about things like bias in algorithmic systems and concerns that people had around algorithmic systems, there was a tendency to frequently go back to also the question, but what about the kind of data that is being collected? So data is always a big part of the conversation around algorithmic systems, and people's concerns around what happens with the data. So it was peripherally, it came in. We didn't look particularly at health system and health data. At the core, people have concerns around handing over data because we've had so many instances of finding out after the fact that data has been used in a different way than you expected. Effectively, this is where we're seeing the legacy of bad behavior undermining people's trust, to the point that a lot of the COVID tracking apps and those kinds of things never got off the ground to any significant level, because people just don't trust any app that they have on their phone. So I don't know, Philip, did you want to add something?
And yet they have those apps on their phone and they carry it with them all the time. But interesting. Philip, did you want to chime in?
I don't think I've got a great deal to add. I mean, that was, as Ansgar said, it was peripheral in the sense we didn't actually. We did a number of case studies using kind of mock-ups of online algorithmic systems. We didn't. Health wasn't one of the areas we specifically covered, so we didn't, of course, engage with those kind of questions, and we didn't really at all engage with pseudonymization and the things sort of in more detail that people might do to if they distrust an algorithm, for example. But it did come up when we talk about the idea of systemic trustworthiness, that people did say, well, what's going to happen to my data? That's something which people are concerned about. As Ansgar has said, people still use the apps. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that people use apps that they are pretty certain they are using a lot of their data and tracking them because they're just so incredibly convenient, and perhaps reticent about using some other apps which actually, because of their nature, would have a great deal of privacy and security built into them. But nevertheless, people are sort of, well, obviously things like health data are extremely sensitive, and I can understand people will be more reticent about that.
It touches to some of the complexities, I think, around how trust is being built. So, because on the one hand, people don't trust these particular apps because they've heard issues with how the data is being used. On the other hand, trust is also connected to, do I know other people that are my friends that I generally trust? And if they happen to use this thing as well, then that inherently sort of raises the kind of sense of trust of the thing. Well, all of the people I know and trust use this, so then I guess I'm going to use this one. And so if there exists an app that isn't from a major player, it actually has a lot of better data security features in it, but nobody that you know is using it, then people don't. That is a block towards trusting it. It's an unknown entity.
Interesting. I note Jeff Revel has his hand up. I think he wanted to follow up on the topic.
Oh, yes, thanks. Actually, this relates to the question I posted on email, but I'll just make a quick commentary on pseudonymity and anonymity. People don't really understand, certainly citizens don't understand the difference between the two. They are fundamentally different. One is essentially a securitization technology, which is really just a way of protecting the data. And the other one is much more about information reduction to limit the re-identification. And the subtleties of the differences between the two are not generally understood by the populace. and nor is indeed anonymization as a term, which the average citizen sees as a black and white. Either it's anonymous or it's not, which is never, ever the case in a digital context. It's a spectrum of grey, of how likely or unlikely is that data in the wild to be re-identified. And so there's a basic glossary of vocabulary issue that, and I've seen it in the media too, you know, some of the informed media talking about it and just getting it so wrong. It's quite frustrating. It undermines the whole problem. Anyway, I've got a separate question. So one of the challenges of trust and algorithm application is that in my belief, and certainly in the system that I'm building, which is actually a digital safe space for mental health service delivery, is that in a communicating system or system of communicating entities, one of the best things you can do is to secure the communication itself with end-to-end encryption. Of course, what that also requires is that your service provider, i.e. me, has no longer got access to the data that's in that data stream, excluding the opportunity to process it at the client side, which is very limited because of processing power and very limited in terms of data aggregation. So I think there's a dichotomy out there that needs to be, you know, debated and understood, that actually in order for algorithms to function, particularly on real-time data streams, then unfortunately we have to degrade the securitization of the digital information flow itself. And I don't think we've seen enough debate and discussion around the balance between those two. I'd be interested in the commentary from this from this team here about that.
Before getting to that one, I just to briefly go back to the pseudonymization. I think you know, you touch on an important point there, which is people don't understand the terminology, and terminology is a big thing actually when it comes to how people instinctively engage with things. So pseudonymization, well, obviously it's pseudo, which isn't real. So this isn't real anonymization. That means it's not anonymization. So yeah, that's, and but you know, the language that we use impacts on the whole mental image of things, plays heavily also into the whole AI space. Just the use of artificial intelligence is such a thing that shapes people's thinking, and then machine learning, well, learning is like humans, right? And those kinds of things. Regarding the, you know, if you lock everything down to make it super secure, it's actually going to inhibit being able to do various things, especially if you need to be doing them at a certain kind of speed, etc. I mean, it touches to that kind of thing about it's a different type of cost that comes with a lack of trust, and I don't think we've had any real conversations about this, any discussions, and I haven't really seen this being picked up in other fora either. It is, you know, I guess one of the questions of how can we create a trusted community in a space where you don't necessarily know for sure that you're engaging with who you think you're engaging with, because it's at a distance, in order to be able to not have to go to that kind of level of security. It's the same as in the offline world. If I wanted to make everything absolutely secure, then basically I wouldn't be able to ever go anywhere, and the only truly safe house is one that doesn't have a door and stuff like that. So I don't think this is a particularly meaningful answer, but at the core of it, no, I haven't actually seen any discussions around this. It is an issue that probably does need to have more attention, but it raises that question about, okay, but how can you actually create that level of trust? And of course, a big part of that is to do with showing that you as an organization have a track record of behaving in the right kind of way, and potentially using alternative non-technical means of doing the assessment, sort of the audit model, provided you trust the auditor. It's sort of the pyramid of moving trust along to the next stage kind of question. There's probably a need to think beyond the technical as within this kind of question of how do we provide people a sense of security in the way in which the interaction is going. But I think a lot more needs to be done there.
I think I guess the sort of central point I'm trying to sort of state is that if you really want people to trust the algorithm, then you have to understand the algorithm is fed by data, and that sometimes the requirement of the algorithm for access to data requires a reduction in security of the data, which they could have otherwise had if they didn't apply the algorithm at all. And that decision-making process needs to be part of the trust engagement model, is what I'm contending. Otherwise, you're not being open and transparent with the end users, and eventually it will come back to bite you.
I think this does potentially touch on a different dimension to how to address the trust kind of question, which is it's not just about the application, the technology. It's also about the people that are involved with this. They're the people who are building it and those kinds of things. And so that is something that we have seen some areas picking up on, especially Singapore has been picking up on that as a kind of area that they're looking at in regards to AI, which is certifying the engineers, the data scientists, a certification on the person building it as opposed to on the actual tool itself, as a way of providing an additional kind of level of guarantees around of quality guarantees, really.
Thanks for this, Ansgar, and thank you, Jeff, for these comments and questions. Unfortunately, time is really running very short. We should have probably made this a 90-minute session rather than 60 minutes. We'll have to see for the next time. This is not the last one of the sessions we'll have on algorithmic and algorithms and such processes. There was one last question I wanted to ask that Stephen Castell actually put in the chat, and it was regarding the need, or is there the need for a cabinet level minister for AI? Have we reached that level yet? Any thoughts on that?
My first thought is, if there was such a post, would there be any qualified person that we could put into that post? It touches on a different part that is being discussed, which is if we're talking about AI regulation or something like that, do we need to have a new regulator for that, or should it be a additional capability that the existing regulators have? Should it be a case that not just the ICO has to do everything, but rather like the regulator for certain industry verticals, like the health sector, like the transport sector, etc., that they need to be upskilled on being able to do regulating the use of AI in their space? Or is it a case that it's actually the features of the way in which this technology is being used sort of flexibly from one area to another actually means we need to have an AI kind of regulator? And we see different countries taking different approaches to this. The tendency in the UK seems to be into let's create lots of new departments, or not departments, but bodies. The EU has said, yes, we are going to create a kind of oversight group, but the actual regulation, every member state should be allocating the regulatory activities to whichever existing regulator they think is best at it. I think they also have the option of creating a new one. I think there was, I forget which country it was, but it was just recently reading, they were making a strong case that it needs to be, existing regulators need to be picking up. So there's a plethora of approaches to it being pursued. It's challenging because if you say you're going to create a new one just for AI, then it's in a bubble, and potentially cuts off the fact that, like we said, with a lot of these trust issues, to really understand them, you need to be thinking across the organization that is using it. So yeah,
I think the point was cabinet minister was the thing, that level. Yeah, we haven't reached science fiction yet, but we're quite close to it, possibly. Right. Well, thank you very much for this, Ansgar. Unfortunately, we've run out of time already. It's gone so fast. As I said, next time maybe we'll have a slightly longer call. But thank you for coming to update us on the project again, you and your colleagues, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up further on this. There is a mailing list that we have in the chapter that deals with specifically a discussion around this. It's the Open Trust mailing list. I thought I would put it in the chat for those people that are interested in joining, because I don't think there's very much going on there. But Ansgar is on this mailing list. I think you are and can answer any further questions that any of you might have, and of course emailing and so on. Will you be able to share those slides?
Sure.
The few slides. Okay. So what we'll do, we'll have the recording out. It will be linked to the ISOC England, the ISOC website, and we'll have all the chat also will be on there, and any of the references that have been shared here will also be available on there. And with this, I'd like to thank everyone for having attended. We had a good turnout. Hopefully it was something that was of interest to you. We are about to announce a few other webinars, so keep posted on the mailing lists and so on. And if you're not on the mailing list yet, just drop me a note, ocl@isoc-e.org or ocl@gih.com. And that's it. So I hope you've all enjoyed it, and thank you so much. Have a very good morning, afternoon, evening, or night. I've noticed there are people from around the world on this call. So it's been great to have you here. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.